Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Juan. We'll be discussing his research on the Middle East, including his book, Sacred Space and Holy War, The Politics, Culture, and History of Shiite Islam. Welcome to Rip Rap, Juan.
Thank you.
I was really interested in doing this interview with you because the United States has all these things going on in the Middle East, including the invasion in Afghanistan, then the current war with Iraq. So I wanted to have someone like you, with your scholarship on that region, and particularly the history of Shiite Islam. In your book, you talk about how your work has progressed over 15 years. That's quite understandable because the book is looking at a fluid field of interaction over 500 years, from 1500 to the present. This insight you're bringing to it is really vital and important to understand. There are some other concepts in your book that I was interested in reflecting upon. You talk, for example, about the standard view of jurisprudence in Iraq, in Iran, and how Islam looks at jurisprudence.
Well, the traditional way of doing jurisprudence in the Shiite world was that you had seminary-trained clerics who studied long years the major sources of law, which are the Quran, the sayings and doings of the prophets and of the prophet and the imams, the consensus of the great jurisprudence, and then the application of juridical reasoning, including a limited form of syllogism, to particular cases and texts. So these four sources of law are difficult and abstruse, and it takes years of seminary study to master them. And once someone has mastered them, then they become what is known as a religious jurisprudent, or mujtahid. And in the Shiite system, the mujtahids have a choice. They can just remain individuals and keep a low profile, or they can try to rise and become popular. And if they rise in the esteem of their colleagues and of the general public, both, then they gradually become what is known as ayatollahs, or literally it means signs of God. And they can start having lay followers. And the system in Shiite Islam is that if you're not a trained cleric yourself, if you're not a seminarian, then you don't really know what the law is. And you should be asking someone. You should get expert opinion. They've even compared it in the Shiite texts to having a family physician. You wouldn't try to treat yourself if you had a major illness. You would go to see a physician. Well, in the same way, you should resort to a reference point, an object of emulation, who is a trained jurisprudent in the law. And every lay Shiite should have such a guide. And the more popular the guide is, the more followers the guide has, the greater the cleric is. So ultimately, he can rise to become not just an ayatollah, but a grand ayatollah. And there are just a handful of those in the world. So Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani of Najaf in Iraq is one of those individuals to whom millions of people around the world turn for guidance. And so they're kind of a combination. It's an informal system, so it's not a hierarchy like the Roman Catholic Church. But one can rise in the religious hierarchy through the esteem of one's colleagues. On the other hand, it's important also to have a popular base that large numbers of ordinary people turn to one. So they're a kind of combination of cardinal and televangelist. And it's a powerful combination. It gives them enormous moral authority.
Text is very important. I mean, the Quran is central to the whole discourse in that area. That includes reading about it, understanding it, and memorizing it. And I think that some people in the West forget that. They don't quite understand the sacredness of that text and how central that is to religious practices and the formation of discourse.
Yes, the Quran and the sayings and doings of the Prophet and the Imams are major sources for Islamic law. There is a dispute in the Shiite tradition in particular between literalists and people who allow more individual reasoning. So there was a school of Shiism that said just the Quran and the sayings and doings of the Prophet and the Imams. It's kind of a kind of Protestant Shiism, which is only text-based. And then the mainstream tradition that has won out allows for the jurisprudent, both the whole line of classical jurisprudence and the living jurisprudence of today, to have a much bigger impact on the reasoning about the law than just a literal approach to the text. So you could have a jurist who reasoned past a literal understanding of the Quran very easily, and you see this kind of imaginative juristical law in Shiism all the time. And it's made the tradition very dynamic, because someone who's certified to be able to reason about the law really can take off and go in new directions, and it's part of Shiism's encounter with modernity that they then have applied these traditional tools to the new situation.
One of the other topics that people have mentioned to me when we're talking about Islam has to do with women, the concepts about their role in the region. So I'd like to talk about those Shiite beliefs and practices. What about women in terms of discourse and their impact on Shiite ritual life? Are they able to develop their own distinctive set of religious practices and discourse and have arenas of a relative independence?
Yes, in Shiite society, most Shiite society has been characterized by gender segregation, which is that women and men don't mix socially unless they're related or it's a very close family friend. So you really have women's society and men's society, and this is to the extent that in some cases women have developed their own dialect. This is kind of special way of speaking
Really?
that's associated with women because they speak to each other all the time. And there's poetry in it. And then sometimes male poets imitated that female dialect in their poetry. This carries on to religion. Women have their own religious ceremonies. They have their own religious leaders among the women. They will turn to the great jurisprudence, the male jurisprudence, for guidance. But at a local level, I think there are women leaders who have a great deal of influence, who will tell the stories of the persecution of the family of the Prophet. And in Shiism, the family of the Prophet includes, of course, the women. So the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, is a hero to both male and female Shiites, and stories about her are very important. And some Shiite modernists have put her forward as a model for the contemporary Shiite woman. She was an activist. She took on the power structures of her day, and so forth. So I've argued that if you look at the development of Shiite religious practice and ritual practice over time, very frequently women have had a big impact on it. Women in Islamic law more generally, and also in Shiite law, have all along had substantial property rights, which is different from the situation in the West. Until the mid-19th century, women's property rights were very limited. But in Islamic law, women inherited. They didn't inherit as much as their brothers, but they did inherit. They had the right to dispose of their property as they would. And so notable women, women from the aristocratic classes, often were enormously wealthy and influential. And although they couldn't go out in public and play a public role as politicians, they could send male relatives or male delegates out to do their business. So women were involved in large-scale import-export to Europe through their male agents. They had big capital. And then they would give money to the Shiite clergy for certain purposes. And so by doing so, they would often influence ritual practice.
There's many other things I wanted to talk about with you, such as modernity and theocracy in Iran, and how they've radically changed the Twelver Shiite tradition. And those topics include the nativist modernism, the emergence of militarism, and the attempt to increase literacy. Maybe we ought to talk about the attempt to increase literacy, because that's pretty important.
Well, the Islamic Revolution in Iran from 1979 followed on attempts by the modernizing Pahlavis to spread literacy. And the revolutionary government really did succeed in making most Iranians literate, and the literacy rate is up around 70%. And if you take the younger generation, then it's probably close to 100. And includes enormous increases in female literacy, and literate Iranian women, writers, and politicians, and so forth have emerged. So Iran is now no longer primarily a rural, illiterate society. It's majority urban. It's very literate, and the internet revolution is making an impact there. There's blogging, there's email networks. The Iranian puritanical government is very disturbed by these developments, and you read in the Iranian press about, internet dating services being broken up as centers of iniquity. But young Iranian women write weblogs and sometimes talk about their intimate feelings about sexuality.
Oh my God.
So it really is, there's a big cultural revolution going on in Iran that the government is very nervous about.
You also talked in the book about the nuclear program that Iran has, and there's some uncertainty about what all that means. Is it like the steel mill that you mentioned earlier, or is it something that's strategically important? Does it have a certain political validity? There's certainly something that the politicians in the United States are concerned about for various reasons.
Yeah, well, the national intelligence estimate that has come out suggests that Iran is at least 10 years away from having a nuclear weapon, even if they're working really hard to get one, which we can't be sure. So it's not a vital and pressing issue of the moment, but it is a long-term concern. Well, certainly, Iran's neighbors are Pakistan, which has a nuclear weapon, and India's not so far away, and it now has nuclear weapons, and Russia is not far away, and it has nuclear weapons, and Israel has nuclear weapons, and of course the United States troops are in Afghanistan and Iraq on both sides of Iran, and they have not so far away submarines with nuclear weapons. So Iran is surrounded by nuclear powers and is afraid of them. And so has a real impetus to join in this kind of arms race. We're not, I think, we don't have the evidence to conclude conclusively that the Iranians are trying to get a nuclear weapon. And getting one is not so easy. I mean, Iran has a good scientific establishment and it has a lot of money because of the oil wealth, but even with all that advantage, getting a nuclear weapon and doing so secretly is very difficult. They don't, to my knowledge, have a breeder reactor that can just produce enriched uranium or plutonium. The light water reactors that the Shah began building down in Bushehr, I mean, it would probably be a century before you could get enough nuclear material from those to do a bomb. And light water reactors don't produce a lot of such material. It is now alleged by the U.S. State Department and Pentagon that the Iranians may be attempting to use centrifuges to produce fissionable material. However, you'd have to have 16,000 refrigerator-sized centrifuges, and you'd have to get them to process in tandem with one another. It's called cascading. And the likelihood that you could have 16,000 of these cascading in secrecy strikes me as rather low. And I've never seen it alleged that they have more than a few hundred centrifuges, if they have any at all. So it may well be that the Iranians are working on a bomb. We don't know, but if they are, it's going to take them a while. And it seems to me that The world community has to make this decision as to whether it wants to intervene on this issue and how it could. And it also seems to me that real attention should be given to whether it's wise to have a Middle East with nuclear proliferation. But if it's not wise, then don't we want a nuclear-free zone? And it seems to me one way that you could maybe do diplomacy with the Iranians and get them off this track, if they're in fact on it, would be to negotiate with the Israelis to get rid of their nuclear weapons, which I think would make everybody in the Middle East sigh, rest easier, and then offer the Israelis what we've offered Japan, which is a nuclear umbrella on behalf of the United States. But as long as there are nuclear powers like Israel and Pakistan in the Middle East, I think there will be an impetus for countries like Iran to try to get nukes.
That's been the curious curse of the nuclear weapon. When one country's got it, the others feel they also need it. And then pretty soon, you've got nuclear weapons all over the place, so that all it takes is one person pushing a button, and you have an instant totalizing disaster. One of the other things you talk about in your book is the challenges posed in places like Iran by political censorship and repression as people try to revive the civil society. And I think you mentioned something about the web blog, which is fun in a way, that the internet is so difficult to regulate.
Well, the hardliners in Iran are very attentive to the dangers to them of a lively civil society, and they're trying to stamp it out, and they've had a lot of success. So enormous numbers of newspapers have been opened since 1997 when you got the reformist President Khatami in, but the hardliners just closed them all down. Student organizations and demonstrations have been brutally repressed, and then the liberals in parliament, or the reformists in parliament, have been excluded from running for office. They've just been told that no, you can't run. So of course that
kind of shuts it down.
That kind of shuts it down right there. And so the hardliners have taken back control in the most recent election. They've managed to put in this Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who's I think a real intellectual thug and a deeply unreflective man who is somewhat ignorant. He's millenarian. He's waiting for the promised one to come at any moment. And he says these wild things. I think he has no compunction about robbing people of any civil rights they may have. And that's their vehicle for controlling the society. So I think Iran has taken a real turn away from that opening that had begun in 1997. And I don't expect it to end well, because we know that the vast majority of Iranians are sick and tired of this government, and only about 15% would vote for it if they had a choice. And I think the recent presidential elections were rigged. There was enormous voter fraud. And of course, the rigging also happened up front, in the sense that a lot of important reformist candidates were simply told they couldn't run, either for parliament or for president. So it's been disheartening to see the ways in which this hopeful opening that began in 1997 has gradually been closed off and killed. And now we have the president of Iran saying inflammatory things about wiping the Israelis off the face of the earth, and so forth. So it seems to me that things are not going in a good direction.
How do you think that's all going to play out in terms of the Middle East over the long run? I mean, Iran is part of the dynamics of that region. How do you think, how do you think that's all going to play out in terms of the Middle East over the long run? I mean, Iran is a part of the dynamics in that region.
Well, Iran was blocked when it first made its revolution in 1979 from very much regional influence. The Sunni Arab countries, Egypt and others, largely mobilized to contain the revolution. Iraq under Saddam was part of that effort, Saudi Arabia and so forth, and succeeded. So, in the Iran-Iraq War, which was fought between 1980 and 1988, The Arabs all sided with Iraq, the secular Arab state, even if they were themselves, like the Saudis, were more religious. They didn't like Khomeini, and they didn't like militant Shiism. And of course, Khomeini preached that Islam is incompatible with monarchy, and so all of the monarchies in the Middle East were very afraid of it. So it was contained. Iranians actually were very disappointed by the reaction in the Middle East to their revolution and their new state. Then they were at daggers drawn with the Taliban. They had very bad relations with the Taliban and almost went to war with them in 1998. They don't have good relations with Pakistan. So Iran was basically contained and surrounded back in the 80s and 90s. Ironically, U.S. actions since 2003 have helped the Iranians get out of that box. The Taliban were overthrown, and the Northern Alliance that the United States put in power in Afghanistan instead are Iranian allies. The Tajiks, Rabbani and others, the Shiite Hazaras, the Uzbeks, these were all getting money and help from Iran before. So basically Iran has a lot of friends in Kabul now, which it didn't before, and the Pakistanis are very upset that the United States has basically flipped Afghanistan over to being an Iranian sphere of influence. And then Saddam had kept a lid on the Iraqi Shiites, but he's gone. And in the January 30th, 2005 elections, the religious parties among the Shiites came to power. The Dawa Party, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which had been based in Tehran since 1980, only came back in 2003. These parties came to power. They're the ones that formed the government. Ibrahim Jafari is Dawa, Abdulaziz al-Hakim is Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. They had a reliable, I think, 54% of seats in parliament. They immediately went off to Iran and made all kinds of deals with the clerics in Iran about pipeline interchanges, and the Iranians will refine petroleum for the Iraqis. The Iranians offered the use of their port facilities to import things overland then into Iraq from Iran. They offered $1 billion in foreign aid. It was a love fest here last June. So they went from having an avowed enemy in Saddam Hussein in Iraq to having a very friendly government, and these people had been their guests for decades. And of course Iran has influence in Damascus, and through Hezbollah in Lebanon it has influence in Beirut. So since 2003, Iranian regional influence and diplomacy has become much more successful than it had been before.
Juan, thank you for appearing on Rip Rap. Your book is a very important and significant contribution to understanding that complex and controversial area. We need to understand that region better. And I think your book on sacred space and holy war helps us do that.
Thank you very much, Jim.